This lesson is entitled The Abbasid Empire, and this is part 4 of a 6-part series on the rise and spread of Islam. Now, remember, the Abbasids came from, the northeastern region of the Muslim lands, the northeastern corner of the Umayyad Empire, and they were a Sunni group, but they did ally themselves with the mawali, right? These mixed Arab, non-Arab Muslims, as well as the Persians, who by and large were Shi'a. And they swept out of the northeast and conquered Persia, Mesopotamia, and finally Damascus, and took control of the Ummah and over the Muslim Caliphate itself. And this set up the Abbasid Empire. Right? The empire was already in place, and it's the Abbasids who come in and take over. And interestingly enough, they rejected their Shia allies, which was kind of a stab in the back, and immediately started to centralize power in ways that the Umayyad really hadn't. They also moved their capital to Baghdad, the capital of modern-day Iraq, and really started a new era of luxury and wealth and oppression. I mean, they're in many cases much worse than the Umayyads had been, and they became more luxurious and lazy and wealthy and spoiled than the Umayyads did. So it's kind of an interesting, power corrupting cycle of empire kind of thing. But like I said, they did align themselves tightly with the mawali, and there were increased conversions of mawali and increased acceptance of non-Arabs within the Ummah and within the government of the Abbasid Empire. And they really pushed for conversion in ways that the Umayyads and the early Bedouins hadn't, which shows you, the importance of religion on statecraft. Right? I mean, as I've told you before, sometimes it's warfare that brings people together, but very often it's culture. And the Abbasids recognized that the more Muslim converts they could create within their empire, the stronger and more culturally united their empire would be. And even though they rejected the Shia, they did have a strong role for Persian bureaucrats within their empire. In fact, some people have suggested that really what the Abbasid Empire was a new Persian Empire. Again, Persia was a much older, more sophisticated empire, and in some ways was able to influence this, brand new upstart empire and make it its own. But under the Abbasids, a huge expansion in trade, right? Europe at this time is becoming more peaceful and organized under the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire. And China is becoming more stable and peaceful as well after the fall of the Han Empire, or Han Dynasty. And so the Silk Roads start reactivating. Also, improvements in sailing technology allowed a trade network to develop in the Indian Ocean, the so-called spice routes, or the Indian Ocean Basin Network. I think spice routes is a little catchier term. But there was a lot of wealth that was generated because of increased trade at this time. And interestingly enough, I keep pointing out the relationship between Muslims and Christians and Jews. Very often they went into business together because Muslims aren't allowed to work on Friday, Jews aren't allowed to work on Saturday, Christians aren't allowed to work on Sunday, and so if all three of them got together, they could do business 7 days a week. So early trade ventures within these regions were often multi-religious in nature, and mostly what they were trading were luxury goods, right? Silk, spices, metals, gems. Remember, most regions and most civilizations had been on their own at this point forever, and so they didn't really need anything from anywhere else, but they sure wanted things from other places, like luxury goods. This also led to increasing urbanization, right? The root word of urbanization is urban, which just means city. So urbanization is that process of more and more people moving into cities. And under the Abbasids, their cities became really remarkable places. They had a high focus on building schools and mosques and hospitals, and there were a lot of improvements that took place under the Abbasids in the STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because the Abbasids were in a unique position to blend those older Hellenistic Greek ideas, as well as things that the Romans brought to the table, and then Indian mathematical knowledge. And a lot of times, too, the Muslims weren't held back in the same ways that the Christians were. The Christians, for example, were very much against doing autopsies because they didn't believe bodies should be violated like that. The Muslims didn't have those beliefs, and so they would do autopsies, and their medical knowledge was much more sophisticated than Christians at the time. And of course, with the Indian caste system, anyone who is talented and brilliant in the math and sciences who was born to a lower caste probably wouldn't have been educated very well. And that's an interesting part of world history. Civilizations that try very hard to educate everyone, poor people, racial, ethnic differences, religious differences, women, the civilizations that try to educate everyone end up being much more powerful and sophisticated. It's the civilizations that enslave people and hold people down that end up losing in the long run. But like the Umayyads before them, the Abbasids experienced a period of spread and then a period of decline, right? They spread into South and Southeast Asia, and those are going to be the topics of our next two lessons. But they started to be plagued by these internal divisions, right? You have these Shi'a who are still angry about their treatment by the Abbasid rulers, trying to assassinate every major leader they can find. And remember, the Persian bureaucrats who are largely running the empire come from a majority Shia region. And still, the Abbasids, like the Umayyads, the Abbasids didn't have a succession policy. The Umayyads did, right? The Umayyads, succession was based on family. The Abbasids weren't organized that way, so there's no succession policy. So there's all kinds of infighting and civil wars anytime a caliph dies. And like I said, there's that wealth and luxury again. And so because there's no succession policy, there start to be these civil wars after the death of the fourth Abbasid caliph in 809 CE. And the winner of that succession battle ended up building a slave army of Turkic people from Central Asia. These are the people north of Afghanistan. These are, once again, ding, 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 the horse people. The Xiongnu, the Huns, we're going to learn about the Mongols. And so here come the Central Asian raiders again, but this time they're a slave army serving the Abbasid caliph. But anytime you're going to grow an army, you're going to have to tax your people a lot. And so, this ended up creating a huge vulnerability for the Abbasid rulers. And even more waves of nomads from the north, right? The Umayyads, who came from northern Persia, ended up conquering Baghdad, but they left the Abbasid caliph on the throne, right? Because they didn't want to control the empire. They just wanted to control the caliph. Then they can control everything, right? And then in 1055 CE, the Seljuk Turks come down from Central Asia, and these were a Sunni Muslim people, and once again, these are those horse people of Central Asia, and they come in with that tough cavalry. They purged the Shia Umayyads, and they defended the Ummah against a Byzantine conquest, and set up a very short rule at the end of the Abbasid Empire. Also from the west, we get the Crusades, right? In 1096 CE, the Pope, who, as you know, or may not know, is the head of the Catholic Church. And he orders all Christian knights to join together to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. And in 1099 that happened. The Crusaders did take Jerusalem. But interestingly enough, the Crusades didn't have a very large impact on the Muslims. The Abbasids, anyone outside of themselves. they were successful in Palestine, in the Holy Lands there, but they really did very little to this larger Muslim empire. However, the Crusades did have a big influence on Europe, and I'm going to talk about that in our upcoming lessons on Western Europe. And so, like I said, the Abbasids had a very rich culture. A big topic in the art of the time was calligraphy, right? Because for Muslims, creating images of the human body was worshiping something other than God. Just putting worshiping not God, right? Allah. To make an image of anything other than, or to make an image of anything human and really, bow down before it. Oh, look at this beautiful painting, was a form of idolatry. So very often, Muslim art focused on calligraphy, right? This fancy writing. Continued emphasis on poetry and historical epics. Remember, going back to the Bedouin roots, art had to be portable. The Abbasids were also known for their very fine fabrics. And like I said, in the sciences, algebra comes out of this time period. In fact, algebra is an Arabic word. And then geometry and astronomy. Again, this rich mix of Greek and Indian ideas, but also Chinese as well. You got to remember, the Muslims sat right in the center of the world. And so they were able to learn from everyone and synthesize it into something much greater. And they also were conduits. They also transmitted learning like paper making and ceramics and silk weaving to Europe, technologies that would allow Europe to become very sophisticated in the centuries that followed. And as I've told you before, their surgeries were just much more sophisticated because they could do dissections. Towards the end of the Abbasid era as well, Sufism rose. And remember, the Umayyads and the Abbasids were Sunni. And Sunni Islam is very by the book. It's very scholarly. It's very much about laws and rules and how do you act. The Sufis kind of turned this back and focused on a more mystical or emotional relationship with Allah. Mystical kind of means, the things unseen, the more magical part of religion. And, they built these small communities of men who are kind of like monks in Buddhism and Christianity. And they believed that they could get to God through meditation and music and dancing and drugs, right? Anything that could induce a sense of ecstasy and oneness with God and pull people out of their bodies. That's what the Sufis were after. Right? And so finally, the Abbasids collapsed. The luxury, the divisions inside the empire, the infighting, the growing Persian power, and in come, once again, another Central Asian horse people. This time it's the Mongols, who we will study in depth later in this unit. And then the Mamluk Turks, who are a slave army, took control of Egypt. The Ottoman Turks ended up coming out of northern Iraq, right, northern Mesopotamia, and taking control of the Ummah and shifting the rule of the Ummah to Istanbul, the old capital of the Byzantine Empire, after the fall of Baghdad in 1401. So, again, you get these Turkic peoples from Central Asia who, are just kind of thrashing the Abbasids, final days and settle out. And you're going to want to keep an eye on the Ottomans, right? Both the Ottomans and the Mongols, because it's the Ottoman Turks that will really be the heads of the Ummah and the heads of Islam all the way until World War I in the 19-teens. So, a good 600 years. And so once again, right, what do we see here about the cycle of empire? What themes do you recognize which can help us to come back to this question of why empires fail? And as I always, press you with, how can this help us protect our own civilization and nation? Thanks for watching.